As a sex therapist, as an educator, it is often that people come for issues related to fantasy or questions concerning sexual fantasies, what it means about them, what it says about them, why they have them. Some people experience a lot of anxiety because of the fantasies that they have, or they experience a lot of trepidation about the fantasies that they have, especially when it comes to sharing it with their partner. Everyone has heard of fantasies, but today on the podcast, we are going to explore what are sexual fantasies, how do our sexual fantasies benefit our sexual health, what is the benefit of having these fantasies, and what do our sexual fantasies say about us? So, before we begin, I want to talk about what sexual fantasies are not. And sexual fantasies, pay very close attention to me, because a lot of people really get this confused. And this is where a lot of the confusion and misconceptions about sexual fantasies arise. Fantasies in general, if you will. Sexual fantasy is not an indicator of sexual orientation or behavior. I want to repeat that one more time. This is very important. If you don't get anything else from this podcast today, I want you to get this very point, that your sexual fantasies or your partner's sexual fantasies, anyone's sexual fantasies, are not an indicator of sexual orientation or behavior. It's not an indicator of intent. In fact, many people have fantasies that they enjoy talking about. They maybe even enjoy masturbating while thinking about it. But these fantasies are things that they would never want to do in person. And that doesn't mean all sexual fantasies. I'm sure there are plenty of fantasies that you want to do in person. But just because you fantasize about something does not mean you want to do it in person. And we see this often. For example, threesomes. Some people who fantasize about this idea would never want to do it in person, would never want to live out that fantasy for a number of reasons. Another example is watching same-sex porn, right? Or fantasizing about same-sex interactions. Having fantasies about same-sex interaction does not mean that you're gay. Doesn't even mean that you're bi. And I know some people are listening going, oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. If you're watching gay porn, then you're definitely gay. But it's just simply not how it works. It doesn't work that way. My favorite movie is The Godfather, and I've seen it a bunch of times. All three of them, in fact, along with Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, The Sopranos, all of that. And I'm still not in the mafia. Because watching something and enjoying it doesn't indicate or say anything about me. It doesn't mean that I'm in the mafia or that I want to be in the mafia. Well, no, it doesn't mean those things. It could simply be something you enjoy. If you're watching the Avengers movies, if you're watching Spider-Man, you're never going to be Spider-Man, no matter how much you enjoy watching it. It's fantasy. It's entertainment. Right? I always say that, when it comes to pornography, it's terrible sex education, but, it might be good sex entertainment. It's entertainment. So then, what is sexual fantasy? Sexual fantasy is a mental image, or it could be a pattern of thought, that can create or enhance sexual arousal. Let's take this example that we had of a threesome, right? It could be very arousing for a person to imagine that multiple people are touching their body and pleasing them. Sexually and non-sexually, right? Like there's a lot of pleasure from just being touched or rubbed. And so having multiple people do that could be very arousing. However, there could be a number of reasons why a person would never want to live out this fantasy in real life. Perhaps the person only likes to be intimate with someone they're in a relationship with. Perhaps they're in a committed relationship. They're in a monogamous relationship already and wouldn't want to get another person involved. Perhaps they already have problems being comfortable with their one partner, and so they would have a lot more anxiety if it was two partners. Perhaps they're worried that one of, the third person in this triad would be a better lover than they are. There could be a number of reasons why a person would never actually want to act on it. These are reasons why a person wouldn't want to act on it, but yet they still enjoy it. Perhaps also, for some reason, the fantasy is just not realistic, right? Like we've all had a celebrity crush. Trust me when I tell you, I've heard men and women talk about, some actor, actress, or singer, and they're like, oh, what I wouldn't give for one night with that person. You've all been there, whether it was a teenager, on throughout your life. You go, wow, I tell you, that person there, what I wouldn't give. And the fact is, that's just a fantasy that's unrealistic. It's okay to think about, but it's not okay to expect it necessarily to happen for reasons outside of your control, right? But it's nice to have this mental image. For some other people, they may love the idea of kink play, BDSM, and I know we have people that listen who are actively involved in the kink community, and that's great. But for some people, it's not part of their activity. It's just part of their fantasy, right? They like the idea of getting handcuffed or spanked and so forth, right? But they would never do it. And once again, this could be for a number of reasons, right? They have a fear of letting go. They have an inability to fully trust their partner to this level of losing control. Maybe they just don't actually like feeling pain. They don't like the sensation of having their hair pulled or being spanked. But they like the idea of it, but they don't like how it actually feels. So they can fantasize about it without actually experiencing it. So it's very nice to have those mental images. So the two things you need to recognize so far are that sexual fantasy is just a mental image or pattern of thought that can create or enhance arousal. This means that you may be fantasizing while being actively engaged with your partner, and that's okay too. The second thing is that sexual fantasy is not indicative of intent, nor does it reflect a person's sexual orientation. The two things you really need to take away from this broadcast today.